Hello, my name is Marie Gallo-Dyack, and I'm the President and CEO of the Entertainment Industries Council. I'm pleased to welcome you to our panel discussion focused on stories we hear too often, active shooters in schools and in public venues. We will focus on how semi-automatic rifles appear in entertainment and offer the hope that an act of prop substitution could possibly reduce the appeal of this rifle. A rifle associated with overwhelming pain for victims, families, communities, first responders, law enforcement, and the media reporting on tragedies. Our call to action encourages content creators within the entertainment industry to consider stopping the use of semi-automatic rifles and replacing them with other props or dialogue. The common ground between shooters and victims can be found in trauma. The portrayal of that trauma can often result in powerful storytelling component of entertainment. This gives content creators the power to potentially produce a fear-less society where communities can fear less that they'll become victims of someone else's trauma. We encourage the entertainment community to create stories where the characters are the heroes, not the rifles. The first challenge the webinar production team faced was to frame this conversation. Not an easy task, as you all know. The frequency of it, the horror, the shock, the common denominators, motive, revenge, method, semi-automatic rifle, death of the shooter, by suicide and or law enforcement in pursuit. The fear left for survivors and witnesses is staggering. The challenge with little success in preventing future killings. The guilt, the blame, and the pain following these horrible events is shared by families, security teams, first responders, healthcare providers, and school personnel. Thank you to our panelists today for taking the time to be here to discuss this very important topic. Now I'd like to turn it over to our esteemed facilitator, Dr. Keita Franklin. Dr. Keita Franklin is a social worker with decades of experience providing care and leading programs focused on service members and veteran mental health. She is recognized as a national expert in suicide prevention. Beyond her work in suicide prevention, over the years, her primary area of focus has been trauma and how post-traumatic stress disorder can impact family relationships. Most recently, she led a team of mental health professionals that provided crisis support on the ground after the tragedy in Uvalde, Texas. She is going to moderate our discussion today. Keita, thank you.
Thank you, Marie. And I'm pleased to be here with everybody today. And thank you for your leadership in the field as well. As we get started with this panel today, I just want us to recognize that there's a vast disconnect between the number of shootings that involve a semi-automatic rifle. We know this. The information that seems most accurate is whenever there's a mass shooting, it typically involves these particular type of rifles. And we'll talk more about that today. But we have this commonly recognized term in the field now where you'll hear we have an active shooter in the building, or there's an active shooter here in DC, or you'll hear this term. Even young children will say, we had an active shooter drill at school today. So this term is becoming more and more common. And then as Marie shared, there's also trauma associated with this. Of course, when there's an active shooter, but even the thought of something like this happening can be traumatizing, especially for young children. So we're challenging ourselves today to have a rich dialogue, to have a good, healthy debate and a good conversation that can make a difference, that can start additional dialogues and really get the ball started in this area. So we have this amazing panel here, and we're going to talk about a lot of issues that sometimes people even call them like an elephant in the room, because people just don't want to talk about this topic a lot. But we have a panel here today that's willing to do it. So I'm going to ask each and every one of you to share a little bit about your background, your interest in firearms, your interest in the entertainment industry, and or mental health. And if it's okay, we'll start with you, Todd Atkins.
Sure. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here today with an esteemed group of folks coming together to try to find answers, right, to many of these problems that have already been discussed. And that's the important first step, that we agree that discussion will get us there, and the politics surrounding the gun-related issues is very toxic, and we understand that. So the simple fact that, frankly, we're describing semi-automatic rifles instead of using terms like weapons of war and other things, again, we'll get into that more, how important these words are, because then we return to our kind of political kind of corner and say, well, I know what you're talking about now, right? You're coming after my semi-automatic rifle. Or the other side, yeah, who needs a weapon of war? I've had about 30 years now, getting a lot of gray hair, in the advocacy space, on the firearm advocacy side, that is promoting, protecting the idea that Americans of all stripes, all kinds and stripes, have the right to defend themselves against violent attack. Now, Keita, you and I, Dr. Franklin, have worked now for quite some time. Again, you don't have gray hair, but I do. When you and I came together originally through your very important work at Department of Defense, I think the media doesn't like to highlight when folks like us work together on things to actually help protect our communities. But that's what this discussion is all about, right? Is how do we get out of that toxic public square on this issue and identify the ways we can all work together to help reduce these terrible tragedies that are happening all too often in our community. So I've been here for a long time. And what I hope to offer today is if you want to talk to a gun owner, number one, and number two, somebody who owns all of the above, right? And then finally, number three, somebody who has watched these terrible fights take place in our public square all the while these terrible tragedies continue to ensue. So I think there's a lot of answers there, believe it or not, but they're not as attractive as having folks jump up and down and scream at each other for a lot of the folks in the media space. So anyway, I look forward to it.
Thank you. And I'm hoping throughout the panel too that you'll talk more about your interest in the entertainment industry and mental health too in general. So that would be terrific. And how about you, Dr. Hargarten? Stephen?
Thank you, Keita, and it's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here talking about a vexing, challenging, in my world, a public health crisis and a public health issue. Yeah. I'm an emergency physician. I have treated hundreds and hundreds of gunshot victims throughout my 40 years in emergency medicine, and I see this as a very major challenge. And framing this in a way that we and others in healthcare provides perhaps a complementary avenue for discussion. And it's great, Keita, to have you as part of our panel because many of us are framing gun violence as a biopsychosocial disease. Biologically, we know that a bullet shatters livers, particularly from an AR-style 15 rifle. We know that. But the other elements of that injury, not only to the patient, but also to the families that you have taken care of, have ripple psychological and social care issues that I think are so important to better understand and to intentionally take care of it. And we are now seeing bullet clinics where not only the trauma surgeon, but a psychologist and a social worker are there concurrently taking care of patients. And so I think that's a real interesting, important development as we seek to take care of patients more comprehensively and more intentionally beyond that biomedical injury that the bullet imparts to the femur, to the liver, to the chest. And so I welcome this conversation and welcome the opportunities to advance discussions in a constructive way.
No, thank you so much for that information about your background as well, and the idea of transgenerational transmission of trauma that can extend well beyond the event or the shot. But yes, absolutely. How about you, Nathan Monell? Can you share a little bit about your background as well?
Well, I'd be happy to, Keita. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Nathan Monell. I'm the Executive Director of National PTA, the National Parent Teacher Association, and we represent the 24,000 schools across the country who have PTAs, and 2.5 million parents across the country who are very invested and engaged and their child's well-being. We're the oldest and largest child advocacy organization in the country. And we believe that the issues that we're talking about today are critical to the well-being success of our students as well as their academic success. So our interest in the topic is longstanding. For about 20 years, we've been very active in working on reasonable gun control issues in order to reduce violence in our communities. We have partnered with many of the leading gun prevention organizations and working on strategies that can bring about reasonable change that will make a difference. And we've had some success in the last year, which we're happy about, but there is more work to be done by far. I'm also a member of the TV parental guidance control group that helps us the television ratings, and we're very actively involved in that to make sure that parents have the information necessary to make good decisions about the entertainment that their family members will consume. And so I see this intersection as a place where we have a great deal of interest.
This is great. I appreciate hearing about your background. It's definitely relevant for this conversation. So thank you for joining us. I want to make sure that we hear about Pam's background, and then we'll get right into the dialogue here.
Hi, all. It's great to be here as well. My name is Pamela Vona, and I am the co-founder of the Center for Safe and Resilient Schools and Workplaces. Since 2007, our center has focused on supporting school districts in their attempts to prevent, respond to, and then recover from acts of whether it be community violence or school violence. Our center has been on the ground at many of these large-scale events, including Columbine, Newtown, and Parkland. We have a lot of lessons learned. And while we've really focused on what schools can do to prevent acts of violence on campus, I think we're realizing that there's only so much superintendents and principals can control. And there is so much going on outside of the school, whether it's in the media, whether it's in the community, whether it's policy, that superintendents don't have control over. And so I think they need a voice in this dialogue. And I'm happy to be here to share our experiences.
This is terrific. I mean, this idea that violence could occur in a community and not impact the school is just probably a myth, where the kids spend 6, 7, 8 hours a day. Even if it didn't occur in school, it's impacting the whole system.
Exactly.
This is great. I appreciate learning about your background. I can't wait to hear more as well. As we dig in and get started, I want to start with you, Todd, with the first question just about language, just because we know that language matters. And sometimes we can use the wrong words and find ourselves in the wrong conversations. And I have learned so much from you over the years, as far back as our time working with troops in the Pentagon, around what is the right language. And we hear gun, we hear firearm, we hear semi-automatic, we hear assault rifle. Can you just sort of set the stage about this conversation, sort of elephant in the room around all these different types of terms?
Sure. And we'll get into it a little bit more later, but my published research, believe it or not, is on the power of the media in changing attitudes, in provoking political activity, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of power in the media, and anybody who suggests otherwise is not playing straight. Well, the reason the media has so much power is the reach, and the reach is done through communication of various sorts, video communication, but words always matter. We still tend to be, even today, a text-based kind of organism that still derives a lot of our understanding of the world around us through text. So words matter a great deal. And as I've already shared, probably among the first things you and I had discussions about, do we call this a gun? Do we call it a firearm? Do we call it a weapon? Well, those 3 words, actually, I've run the experiments with just average Americans, have 3 much different meanings. Well, then when we get into the space talking about semi-automatic rifles, you can characterize those in a number of ways. This is a semi-automatic rifle. It's how it functions. That's kind of as vanilla as you can get, right? Or it's an assault weapon. Now, I might add that was a phrase created in the political space actually some time ago. and the people creating that phrase understood the power of those words together to describe to your average non-gun owning American, well, who needs an assault weapon, right? So the power of these words matter. And I will just say it's pretty simple for me. If you see it utilized a lot in the public square, in the political fight over how we regulate guns or who should have them or which ones should be banned, that phrase then carries with it all that baggage when you try to have just a one-on-one discussion with a patient, with a student, because that student is going to talk to their parents or a parent or a superintendent or a movie producer. All that baggage comes with those words. So if we're trying to actually stay in this more logical reason space where we can trade ideas about a policy issue or a problem we're having, don't bring the loaded words to the argument, right? We all know that in our very personal relationship. Don't start pushing buttons, because guess what? The person on the other side of you, or potentially on the other side, is going to run. They're going to grab that shield, hold it up. Okay, now I know I'm in for a fight. So when it comes to something that so many Americans hold very dear, the Second Amendment and their ability to defend themselves and their loved ones, you may disagree with that, but understand that that's real for them. It's very real for me. So that when politically charged words are deployed in your discussion with them, whether it's 1,000 of them or one-on-one, get ready, because logic's going to be gone. Reason's going to be gone. And I don't think we ever arrive at good answers based on emotion when it comes to our community and its health. So just think of it that way. If I've heard this weapon of war thing out in the public square, when I'm trying to convince somebody we have to address problems in our community, probably shouldn't deploy that word while having that phrase while having this discussion. And it
So what
seems
is-
simple.
What is
Go
a
ahead.
semi-automatic rifle, though? What is that specifically for folks that may not know? This is like a rifle that has rapid fire, or like, could you talk more about that? Like
It's
what
the
it is?
basic functioning. All firearms will have a reloading mechanism. That's what we're really talking about here. Now, so like a revolver, the old-timey traditional handgun you would see Detective Joe Adams carry while he's solving the case with a round cylinder, that's a revolver. You reload that 6 at a time. You pull the trigger and it fires.
Okay.
Semi-automatic rifles, all right, the AR platform rifle and many,
Yeah.
many others have an internal gas system. It reloads itself. You pull that trigger, it's going to reload faster than you can see it. You pull the trigger.
It
it's
will
ready.
reload itself, and how many times and what's the implications of that type of a shot in that certain time frame?
Yeah, and related to that debate then, particularly important when you're discussing semi-automatic rifles, is then it will have a magazine that holds the cartridges and how many cartridges are held in that magazine. So we hear the argument often about who needs a magazine that holds 15 or 25 or 30. Well, again, that semi-automatic rifle will reload until
Okay.
that magazine is empty.
But it holds a magazine and cartridges. Okay. And I know others on the panel may know these terms, but I'm afraid some folks listening in may not. And so I know, and we've had these conversations, and every time I learn something, each
Well,
and every one. So it's a process.
And I've run this experiment as recently as last year too. There are a lot of just average Americans who, when they hear weapon of war and assault weapon, what they run to, and this, you might think this is a distinction without a difference. And I would say, I understand why you would say that. They think you're saying machine gun,
Yes.
where you press the trigger,
Yep.
like you're watching a war movie and it's just going. There is an important difference between the AR platform rifle or semi-automatic rifle that I can buy here in America and what our troops use when they're deployed overseas. There's an important difference. Semi-automatic for Todd, fully automatic or selectable to fully automatic for that trooper who's been deployed somewhere in the rest of the world, or a police officer for that matter.
Semi-automatic, fully automatic, law enforcement, military. versus, okay, this is good dialogue. We'll continue to kind of come back to some of these terms. I want to ask you, Stephen, with regard to some of this conversation on language, when we're talking about a revolver, or we're talking about a semi-automatic rifle, how does this play itself out when people show up in our nation's emergency rooms? Like, what does it look like? I, as a mental health clinician, have engaged quite a bit on the emotional aspects and the psychological aspects. But physically, like, what do you see in the ERs when people present?
So again, it's a great question, and I fully agree with Todd that words matter, that definitions matter, and I think it is important to be very clear about what you're saying and very clear about what you're not saying. And so I think it's a very important discussion to have and continue to have. From my world, in the world of trauma surgeons and those taking care of the physical injury caused by a bullet, the bullet penetrates, sometimes it perforates. Perforation meaning it goes through the victim and into another victim or into a wall or whatever. So a bullet perforates, and the energy, which is what we've been studying more recently, the kinetic energy, 1/2 mass times velocity squared. So the velocity of the bullet really matters, particularly relative to the mass of a bullet. And so a bullet released from a revolver or from a pistol, let's say a 9mm 40 caliber, has a certain amount of energy traveling at a predictable around 1,000 feet per second or so. It varies a little bit.
Okay.
But then you have then an assault style rifle that Todd was explaining. That bullet travels sometimes over 3,000 feet per second.
Okay.
And when you have velocity differences, that translates to injury differences that we see in patients. And so to have that energy impact a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 25-year-old will have predictable differences in outcome.
Okay.
They may not survive beyond the initial event. There were no survivors. There were no children survivors in Sandy Hook.
Right.
Of the Uvalde victims, about 5 survived from that bullet. In Parkland, half the students survived when they were struck by those bullets discharged from that semi-automatic rifle. And so the energy does matter. The injury patterns matter when we're trying to take care of and salvage those patients when they've been injured by these bullets. So bullets matter. And I think, again, the phrasing and the issues surrounding this challenging public health burden we see in communities that it impact churches and schools and places where people gather is a real challenge to, again, be very clear about what you're saying and what you're not saying. And I'll end with this phrase that I think Todd is pretty familiar with. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. And I would take a scientific difference with that, as Senator Moynihan said about 25 years ago. Guns don't kill people, bullets do. And we know that. And we study it just like we study other bacteria and viruses that adversely affect our children and adolescents. And so I think that to us is a very good way to, again, advance our discussions in a way that advances science and our understanding of the behavior of these bullets that are a little different from a rifle, from a handgun such as a pistol or a revolver. So I'll stop there, but it's a really important discussion that we're having, again, with words do matter.
Yes, it is. And I don't think we've dug deep into this part of the discussion before in such a way to identify different types of bullets and their impact physically on people that show up in it for care. And whether it's close range or farther range, or whether the speed and all the extenuating circumstances that you end up treating when you see people. I mean, do you see people, I guess I'm sort of asking an obvious question, when people come in and they have semi-automatic wounds, you can tell the type when you're looking at them from an ER surgeon perspective versus the other type, and you can tell just by looking at the perforation and the damage that was done?
not as easily as one as you're summarizing, Kita. So the
Okay.
entrance wounds may be different because they hit another structure before striking the individual and penetrating. So we can
Okay.
sometimes differentiate a larger caliber bullet wound than a smaller caliber,
Okay.
but it's also the exit wound that is apparent with our patient populations and so forth. So wounding characteristics at that moment that we need to make critical immediate decisions is very challenging. But better understanding of this will help us understand that this individual was injured by a bullet from a rifle that has implications that are different than a handgun, for instance. So having that information may give the surgeon a little bit of a upper hand of developing her strategy to go into the operating room to mend the wounds. So it's an important area that we're exploring that is very important because we now have the technology to examine this in a way that we've never had before, just like we use technology to understand car crashes and the injuries related to those individuals who are an occupant in a car. So we've learned a lot over the past many decades to understand these events that take place in less than a tenth of a second.
Sure. I know I want to go over to you, Nathan, but before I see that Todd has something, so I'm gonna scoot to Todd and then back over to Nathan.
Yeah, I will take 2 seconds. Dr.
Please.
Hargarten makes an excellent point. But we have to make sure that for the audience members, it is not the function of a rifle being semi-automatic that produces velocity. That is a function of the cartridge itself. That cartridge running at 3,000 feet per second or 2,200, or some can even approach 4,000, is a function only of the cartridge and the type of cartridge used. So just so folks don't conflate those two, that's what rifle cartridges, that's how they differ from handgun cartridges, generally speaking, is that rifle cartridges are built differently and they produce higher velocities. So the semi-automatic versus bolt action versus lever action function of a firearm is irrelevant to what velocity that cartridge is going to produce.
Which is why he was saying bullets kill people.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Okay. No, this is
a great good point that Todd's raising, and so that it brings us to another level of discussion that we can have. But it's a very important point.
No, thank you. Okay, so we talked a little bit about physical. I want to go over to Nathan to talk about child development and emotional aspects. So from where you sit, both on as a PTA leader at the national level, but also your involvement in the entertainment industry and just all that you know about how entertainment shapes children. What is the state of the field? Like, what would you say is the current state with this topic right now on how shows and movies influence the way children behave? I'm in particular looking for this sort of thing we hear about how kids see something on a movie and they go get a firearm and they go to school and they do mass shootings, or they go, to local McDonald's and there's a shooting. Like, is that true? Like, what's the state of the science here? You might be on mute, Nathan. Let me see.
I apologize.
Okay, very well. Thank you. Start over.
So let's start with consumption of media. We certainly know that one of the ways that our children grow and mature is through the consumption of media. So whether it's television, movies, music, interactive games, or other media, they are significant inputs into what our children become. And those can be terrific tools for growth, exploration, knowledge, enjoyment, entertainment, the music, the arts. And they can also be, unfortunately, resources for damage to their character or their well-being. There's well over 1,000 studies now, including reports from the Surgeon General's office, from the National Institute for Mental Health, from most of the medical and psychological organizations, as well as public health resources, that point overwhelmingly to a causal link, linking the consumption of media violence with aggressive attitudes, values, and behaviors among children. So it's not an unknown, it's a known. So what do we do about that? we have to continue our efforts to reduce and eliminate violence and programming to which children are exposed. Easier said than done, as any parent knows. But there are multiple players who are responsible for making sure this happens. The regulation of violence in media, the marketing of violent materials to minors is best accomplished by the people who create that product and the people who are part of the entertainment industry. And when they do that successfully, we can limit the amount of exposure that young people have to violence. And if they don't do that successfully, they should be monitored and censored by the actions of the Federal Communications Commission. But we don't think that responsibility falls just with the entertainment providers or creators alone. National PTA believes that families and schools and the government and the entertainment industry are all partners in making sure that we protect children and adolescents from exposure to things that are not helpful for them. And so we tell parents, this is your job, your part, what you have control over.
Parental responsibility.
What your children are watching. Don't set them with the device and walk away. Set time limits for them about how much they're consuming on their devices and how much time they're spending IRL in real life. And use those various rating systems that have been created, like the TV Monitoring Board's guidelines and the Motion Picture Association's ratings. Make sure that your child is consuming what's right for your family, right? You may follow the age guidelines that may be appropriate for you, and it may not be. But at least you have the information necessary to make an informed choice. And we support any industry attempts to make sure that adult programming is not available in the early afternoons or the early evenings when children are more likely to be watching entertainment that is not supervised by a parent. And then parents can have ongoing proactive conversations with their children about what they're watching, what they're consuming, what it means to them, how it makes them feel, how it affects their behavior, what they see at school that might reflect some of the things that other folks are seeing in the media. That's good. If parents can talk about their own consumption activities, because kids learn what's modeled for them, and they see that we're watching lots of violent television, then they're going to say, well, that's okay. I can't wait till I can consume it myself. So we want to raise children who are educated and successful entertainment consumers. So we want to teach them media literacy skills that's reinforced at home, where children and young people can be better able to interpret, to evaluate, and make critical judgments about the images and sounds that make up our contemporary mass media culture.
You bring up a good point, because it's not like one solution. Like, it's not a simple one and done. Like, it involves the entertainment, it involves good parenting, and parents have to be educated themselves in order to do good parenting around it. It involves the just limiting the time when it's on. It's like, it's a multimodal solution set, not just one. And if we just did one, like regulate the entertainment industry, we would like miss out on all these other opportunities. And if only regulation alone works, like we wouldn't be in the spots we're in on all a host of other topics, right? Just
That's
like
right.
having worked in many policy arenas, I know that's not that alone will not solve all of our issues. It's like part of a bundled set. So this is interesting. You were about to say something else.
Yeah, we learned a lot when we went through the attempt to regulate the music industry when Tipper Gore was leading the charge against violence and sexual content and music. And we learned that voluntary choices by the entertainment industry just to identify what might be helpful or not helpful for parents. They have information to make informed choices is the way to go. It beats censorship hands down. We want to give the parents the power to make decisions about what's right for the child.
And I'm sure the parents want their children to have safe behaviors. And so anything they can do around that, having watched some of the interviews of parents that have had children that have done, tragic things, the parents often are like, I didn't know, I wasn't sure, I myself didn't realize this video game meant this, or, when later, they're asked, like, did you know this video game had this much exposure to this type of violence? The parents will say, I just didn't know. Yeah, so this is good. I want to bring Pamela into the conversation too, because she has a lot of experience working with safe schools and safe work practices, and just like, Pamela, can you share with us a little bit about your background and like what you recommend? Like, what techniques do you give schools and workplaces when they're worried about firearm threats? Like, what do you tell them, like, tactically?
Yeah, and primarily my work has been in K-12 schools.
Okay,
And
okay.
what I would really focus on is, what school communities can do. And there is a lot. And I'll take you from the macro to the micro.
Okay.
The most important things that superintendents, principals can assess is their organizational climate. And one of the key metrics to look at is student belongingness and connectedness, right? In general, students who feel welcome, safe, like they have a voice on campus, those are not the students that are going to engage in the types of violent events that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Another preventative measure on the prevention side really is educating our educators. They are right now on the front lines of a mental health epidemic of adolescents and
Yep.
And we need to help them identify signs and symptoms of students who may be struggling and in need of additional evaluation and additional support. We know that students who often engage in these acts of violence, they're going through their own kind of adversity. And what they need is the connection of a trusted adult. But oftentimes, teachers are reluctant to make that overture to the student because they don't feel equipped to say the exact right thing. Therefore, they don't make the connection. And what they don't realize is that overture in and of itself could have been a pivotal intervention
Mm-hmm.
for that student.
And then let me ask you one little side question about this. What do you do about these school systems where, definitely belongingness, connectedness, they could have the right culture in a school system, and somebody comes in externally and facilitates violence on a school system of which they're not a part? So
I think that's a little bit, again, those are the things that I think schools don't have control over, is a list of things that schools do. Certainly there's things around physical safety procedures and what doors are locked, what doors are not locked, whether there's metal detectors on campus. But in terms of sort of an outside person, they might have some control if it was a former student, for example, who's coming onto campus, and we've seen that before.
Okay.
But really, I think principals and superintendents, they have control over what's happening inside the walls, but outside the wall.
And I didn't mean to sidetrack you. You were going to go from macro down more.
And then I was just going to talk about maybe the threat assessment process.
Okay.
Really making sure schools have a robust threat assessment team and threat assessment process. And that has to be multidisciplinary. We need the principal. We need someone on campus who's responsible for school safety. We need a mental health professional, and maybe one of the teachers who knows that student best. The other thing you're going to do is gather as much information as possible. And this is where we keep getting into this conversation about this being multifactorial.
Yes.
Right? So what we want to do is we want to interview teachers. Who we really want to interview is the other students.
Mm-hmm.
It is often not a surprise to students when they learn who the actor was in many cases, right? And so we really need to elevate the voices of students and make them feel safe enough to share that information. The other thing is we need to monitor, and this is where it relates to our conversation today, the media that they're engaging with and the social media that they're engaging. And based on, the data that Nathan has mentioned and Todd and Stephen has mentioned, is that we know from Albert Bandura at Stanford, social learning is a real thing.
Yeah,
and we from what we see. And so we need to be monitoring that. And then from there, we need to make an action plan. And in some cases, that's suspending or expelling the student, but we know that's not always foolproof. And in some cases, that may be a triggering event for a student getting suspended or expelled. And then the other thing we need to look for also is risk factors. The Secret Service put out a report on what some of the key risk factors are. And we know it's family difficulties. Mm-hmm. We know it's peer difficulties or difficulties with a teacher. And then typically there's a precipitating event, something that activates the student to engage. And then on the other side of it, you know, the action plan also needs to attempt to ameliorate some of those risk factors. So if there is stuff happening in the family, how do we intervene there? If there are bullying things happening on campus, we need to intervene there. And then we have to grow. And maybe this is also where the media can get involved. The imagery of protective factors. What do healthy environments look like?
Right, right.
You know what protective factors are. It's a healthy relationship with adult. It's consistency and predictability. It's belonging to a group that has agency. And the more we pick our schools that way and families that way, we can begin to create that imagery.
I want to pull the thread a little bit. These are all such good points about what you were talking about with interviewing kids, and how after the fact kids often are not surprised that other child had a firearm, or that child did what they did. Do you push programming and education to the kids too around peer support, with the idea that kids are a little bit of a sensor for when their fellow peers are struggling? Not only struggling, but also if they happen to know that a kid had a firearm in their backpack, or if they happen to know a kid was playing with one at home?
Well, I think what you would disseminate is what the protocol is for sharing that information, because I don't think you need to train kids in how to do that, especially they have a spidey sense for what's going on with their peers. It's almost, they are neurologically wired to be social at that point in their lives. And so they're really connecting in those ways. But to know who to go to share that information, to know that there are confidentiality things in place, that, you know, they're not going to be, that there isn't going to be some sort of backlash if they report a peer. We need confidentiality things in place. And so, and then certainly, I mean, there is a movement towards resiliency building and social emotional learning. And I definitely think the more students begin to understand themselves in their emotional world, the more they understand their peers in their emotional world. And they have language, like we were talking about, words matter. They have language around these issues, these concepts, and they can share that.
No, these are all such good points. And I so appreciate you bringing up this belongingness and connection, and things like this are at the heart of the profession. And we see in a lot of our study of active shooters that they are often marginalized. Yeah.
And so I think putting it all together is schools do have a lot of things that they can do. But the one thing one of the things they don't have control over is whether a child has access to a firearm.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. Yeah, unless they're told, they don't know. Yeah. Let me talk with you more, Todd, a little bit about this link between mass shootings and mental health challenges. There's always this myth in the field that everyone who engages in a mass shooting, whenever we have one, that inevitably there are always untreated mental health challenges. And the entertainment industry further perpetuates that. And sometimes it's the case and sometimes it's not. But I'm wondering if you can share more about your own assessment of this, the intersection of entertainment, mental health, and firearms.
Yeah, so that's an easy one to solve, right? I will say that although I had suspicions, after I started to engage in the research I conducted, the experiments I started putting people through, I actually undervalued the power of visual messaging from Hollywood. I actually thought, well, it definitely has an effect. I had no idea that it could affect us as human beings in every possible aspect of our life. So I guess what I would say at the end of the day, I'm not pointing fingers at the entertainment industry. I'm saying what a wonderful opportunity they have to showcase through these very powerful tools they have exactly what Pamela was talking about. Maybe there's not enough conflict in showcasing the family that doesn't have issues, or the school that doesn't have issues, or a parent properly storing a firearm. That's not a very interesting storyline. It's supposed to be under my pillow. So, they have such an opportunity to tone down all this vengeance seeking and the super violent vengeance seeking. That's always the answer now. this wonderful opportunity to showcase, because here's what's interesting about the movie house today. When I conducted my research, everybody was going to their echo chamber. Fox News and CNN were starting to build their echo chambers, but social media was just a glint in everybody's eye. Well, now we're all deeply embedded in our own echo chambers. That big screen right now is the only cross-cutting information system left in America.
Wow.
We stream now. We choose our own stuff. I don't like that. That's a liberal show. I don't like that. That's a conservative show. But when my son Tommy says, "Let's go to a movie, Dad," I go, "Okay." It's a wonderful opportunity. My political guard is down on all these various issues to showcase. I'm not talking about, I get it. If we just have movies of people running through fields full of daisies, nobody's going to buy the ticket. I understand it's a business.
Right.
But holy cow, and little snippets here and there showcasing these positive values and sense of community and proactive emotional well-being and properly storing a firearm or whatever it is, right? Instead of what we more typically get now is just, I'm going to take it out on the rest of the world because I got, crossed or killed my puppy or whatever's going on, right? These just, wow, rapid ramp up. So anyway, I know that doesn't get at the question of a 16-year-old who's in trouble that needs community support.
Right.
But I do know it's an immediate answer that Hollywood could provide. It's not the answer. It's a little tiny segment. Hollywood obviously has done a wonderful job educating Americans about a lot of our most controversial subjects and issue areas. Well, they could just decide, guess what? We're going to start to message violence in a particular issue, in a particular way, at least some of the time, right? That's what I would say. The broader based community faults we have now throughout entire systems in many communities, I don't have an immediate answer for that. But we know, just as an example, the media plays a very important, they provoke a contagion effect among these terrible individuals who commit these terrible tragedies. We know there's a contagion effect. That we know that contagion effect exploits existing weaknesses in our systems and our people, right? So the responsibility is clearly there, and I'll just say simply, with responsibility, with that, you gotta exercise it, man. You just got to, and you gotta get creative about how, because like I said, think of it that way. That big screen is the last place in America where we get exposed to something not by choice. There's all kinds of opportunities for me to hear something I'd never even thought of, or see something and just park it in my file cabinet. I never saw that before. I never heard that before.
And with regard to our specific call to action around props in the entertainment industry and the ability of creative designers and people that work on movies and things, and the ability to swap out a prop, is that something that you see could help as a small change in the direction, whether it's a semi-rifle with a revolver or a semi-rifle with something else, maybe changing the script?
Of course it could, but think of this interesting opportunity. Let's say a group of producers is, we've got the script, we're kind of ready to go, but one of the producers says, hey, you know what? There's 100 million gun owners in this country. Can't we just insert right here, for some reason, somebody actually walks to their gun safe and inserts the firearm in their gun safe and shuts the door, and it's not a big deal? Instead, what's the typical storyline that's told? Oh my God, a gun, get it out of this house. Now that's how many people feel, and I respect how they feel about that. But think about how many gun owners are going to be in that audience.
Yeah, so you have to kind of go at it both ways. I think you're right.
Yeah, just always be creative. Always try to find solutions. Maybe we could swap out this for that, just as a prop. It's real quick, but there's so many opportunities that I think are left right on the side of the road because people don't feel they can problematically make a political commitment in a different direction about a firearm. When it's the object of the movie and it's all about violence, then great, just have guns everywhere of all types, fully auto, it doesn't matter. But I'm talking about just a normal slice of life. There would be a lot of power in that safe storage message, and you wouldn't even have to say anything about it.
Safe storage, I know, is definitely one of the big sort of interventions, if you want to call it that we've talked about over the years, just even around suicide risk at a minimum, let alone these other types of mass shootings, and making sure people just don't have immediate access to a firearm, especially when they're not well. I want to ask you, Nathan, about the parents' view of some of this. Todd spoke about contagion effect. And adolescents like to copy one another and they like to mimic one another. And adolescents like, they like group membership and they like to be together. And when you see a group of them in the mall, they all sort of look alike. And they, are the parents worried about this contagion effect? Or are there any other views of the parents that we should know from where you sit representing all these millions of parents that are part of the PTA?
Well, if I can have permission, Keita, I would follow up with something that has just been said.
Oh, please.
Suicide is the second leading cause of death among people aged 10 to 14. And over 80% of all child firearm suicides involve a gun obtained from their own home or that of a friend or relative.
Yes, this is true.
About 4.6 million American children who live in a home where at least one gun is kept loaded and unlocked. And suicide rates among those who live in homes with firearms are 4 times higher than those who live in homes without firearms. Suicide rate by firearms gone up 59% over the last decade. And so I think one of the things that the entertainment industry could do, as been mentioned, is to make the safe storage of firearms an important message. I think there's another message that I want to make sure before we finish today that gets said.
Please. Regarding
school shootings. And by the way, school shootings are only one of our major problems. Suicide, community violence, domestic violence around guns are all related issues. But it is unimaginable that we watch parents have their kids go to school every day without the knowledge that they're going to come home that night. And we move too quickly in the entertainment industry and through the media in covering the resilience. I'm always shocked about how quickly we're talking about Boston Strong, Uvalde Strong. We want to numb ourselves to the pain by talking about the success that we come together and we overcome this horrible thing that's happened. And I think we could better depict, explain, understand what happened to that child who was killed. If we don't have a better understanding of what the deaths of our children are about, we will not make progress. The students who sat there witnessing the violence and the impact it has on them. I remember a Uvalde father sobbing and saying, who could have done this to my daughter? I just watched him and realized the immense pain that he suffered. The officers who fail, who don't rise to the occasion, we've heard their stories in the media. What's that like for them? What do they live with the rest of their lives? And the parents of the shooter and all the things you discussed earlier that they miss. The pain is unbearable, and those stories are not being told. You can find Jeffrey Dahmer stories everywhere. But these stories of people who've been impacted by the violence of school shootings is something that needs deeper study, deeper analysis, and deeper depiction in our media.
Well, it's just, highlighting their grief that never goes away. I know that was one of the questions that I also had for Stephen. So, and we can even shift to that. You see these patients long-term, and I know you're working on their physical injuries, but inevitably you're working on their emotional and psychological injuries as well. I have no doubt. Can you share anything about the lasting impact after they show up?
Well, personally, as an emergency physician, I'm more involved in the preliminary, immediate issues that are needing the other. In fact, for future programs, certainly having a psychologist who's following patients over time with these terrible events would be very, very very, very productive. But I would really like to build on Nathan's comments. Bullets are the most common cause of death of ages 1 to 19 in the United States. It's a bullet. The leading cause of death in the United States for 1 to 19 is a bullet. The leading cause of African American youth is a bullet. And yet the National Institute of Health puts a meager amount of research together to better understand this challenging problem and its not only immediate effects on an individual, but the ripple effects on families and communities. We need more research that really helps us understand and helps us understand the development and the evaluation of constructive programs and policies that help address this major cause of death in the United States. We do this for other health problems. We do this for other age groups and vulnerable age groups. And we're not even talking about the veterans who die by suicide with a firearm. So I think we need more active research in this area as never before. And the NIH and the National Institute of Justice and the CDC and our federal and state agencies can really come together and really do a better job of addressing this in a way that gets at some of the issues that Nathan was starting to talk about that adversely affect our students and our children. And so I might add, he's right about Jeffrey Dahmer, since that was Milwaukee, which is where I'm from. There's certainly attention to these dramas, but I think we do need something around safe storage. And I think we can talk about technologies. The movie industry portrayed a smart gun in one of the James Bond movies. Interesting. Well, where does that come into play where there is a product that has safety features or no safety features? What about technologies that can enhance the product as being only usable by the authorized user? Interesting strategy, one which the industry can perhaps go into, just like the car industry has embraced technology changes in the way they construct cars. I'll leave it at that, but I think it's so important that we advance this discussion with other members.
No, I think you bring up a good point, and we can always tend to more research. And definitely there has, in my own work, have seen not a lot of funding go into research around firearms, and the pendulum sways based on the political environment as to whether or not it's sort of quote unquote allowed to be studied or not over the years. But at the same time, parents that are, so we need more research, and we have to balance that with parents that are struggling with the potential for shootings and violence and right here and now. And so what we don't want to do is advocate for sort of studying and admiring something unless, certainly we do need more questions answered. But in the interim, getting after some of the solutions that we talked on this call would be good, like a both and, I think. Mm-hmm. Are there final comments from yourself, Stephen, or others on the panel before I turn it back to Marie? This has been such an incredible conversation, and I know that we could go on and on based on all the tentacles that it created. I'm looking at you, Pam. Is there anything else from your end, or Todd or Nathan? Anybody on the panel? Final comments?
I will say one thing, just relates to schools, is that students actually want to be at school and they want to feel safe at school. Our center was involved in some litigation down here in Southern California for a school district that was being sued because they were not trauma informed. They were not providing resources to students who had a variety of traumatic experiences. And one of these students was expelled for some behavior. It wasn't violent behavior, but he was expelled. And when the lawsuit happened, what he said was, and because of the just overwhelming trauma that the student had experienced at home, his final words were, "I wanted school to be my safe place. Mm-hmm. I needed school to be my home," because he didn't have one. Mm-hmm. And so again, the more we can create images of that reality for students, and that schools can be a second home for students, I think that's really important.
Where they can feel safe, where they can have adults that they can rely on, where they can get food in many cases. We've read those reports as well, where there's issues around nutrition and things like that, but where they can learn and grow, for sure. Thanks.
All right.
Yeah, I would just say,
Absolutely.
we all have our own hands, right? What's the power that's in our hands? What are the tools that we have? It's easy to say this is a huge societal problem, we'll never solve it. If each of us take the tools that we have, the power and the influence we have, and we utilize that for the public good, and we say, how can I advance this issue based on what I have authority and control over? I think there are many people in the entertainment industry who have an immense amount of power, and we would love to see them partner with schools and others in making sure that we solve this problem. Depiction is an important issue, and we hope we make progress in this area.
No, it's a really good point, and I appreciate you helping to bring it home on that note. Let me turn it back to you, Marie, for any final comments as we wrap up our panel today.
You know, I have a quick prepared closing, but I must tell you, I feel I just feel a sense of gratefulness to be in this room and to listening to everybody that has spoken today. You know, our goal is to wrap up these conversations and get depiction suggestions out to the media and never compromise the entertainment value that we all sort of appreciate in different ways. But this has been just an amazingly rich conversation. I'm taking copious notes here about this. I would like to, two things. First of all, thank you all. And more importantly, let you know that we'll probably be running some of these ideas past you. You know, here's a batch of depiction suggestions. What do you think? What are we missing? What needs to be adjusted? Because our goal is to get this conversation packaged in a way that media content creators could say, especially after the strikes, that media content creators could say, wow, these are some really great ideas. We never thought of this. This could be a new twist. We could be supportive partners in the kind of content that will come out of this. So big thank you. And so my comments, here's what I was going to tell you. Thank you for your professional perspective and personal commitment to the difficult challenge in our culture. As we said earlier, we're going to be ourselves. We're going to encourage the entertainment industry to consider prop replacement. But what's the replacement? It could be other ideas of depictions. It could be other props, but what have you. And we're, of course, going to be getting back to you on this. And I also want to thank our fearless team. So you know Tina, myself, Wendy Laxo has been as a partner in this effort, as well as Kristen Dyack. And I just want to, this has been a small but mighty team, and you all have empowered what we hope to do. So I hope that did you justice, because it's been amazing. Thank you. Take care, everybody. Take care of yourselves.